Thanks so much. I wanted to start. Can everyone just introduce themselves down the panel? First, Andrew.
Sure. Andrew Claster. Background in polling, data, and analytics. And as mentioned, was Deputy Chief Analytics Officer for the Obama campaign in 2012.
Max Docksey, Political Director at the RSLC. Background is in campaigns. Political Director or Campaign Manager has been in my title for roughly the last 12 years. So I think I'm more the application of the data that these guys are going to be talking about today.
And Chris Wilson, I just recently made the move over to a company called EyesOver, which is an artificial intelligence-driven data and polling company. But unlike Andrew, my experience is on losing campaigns. I was a data director on Ted Cruz in 2016 and then DeSantis' Super PAC in 24.
And I'm Domenic, as Steve mentioned, originally from the data and polling space, and that's originally how I came over to the Congressional Leadership Fund. I've now been there for 3 cycles, the last 2 as political director, where we flipped and held the House. So what I wanted to make this panel about was, we're all from the data world and they wanted us to talk about targeting, but how targeting applies to all of you guys is that, our spending decisions at a super PAC, and really a campaign in general, comes down to what moves numbers. And when I say what moves numbers, we're trying to win, right? So when we always use the term moves numbers because we're talking about, well, did that spend change the polling? Did that move the polling to what we wanted to see? And, at a super PAC, a lot of times we're running negative ads. So we're looking at the unfavorability of a Democrat and seeing if we're raising that. A lot of times when you're on a campaign, you're trying to raise your name ID or your own, favorability. But that's what I wanted to make this panel about. What type of targeting on which mediums moves numbers? But, to start this discussion, and Andrew and Chris kind of have the most experience in polling on this panel, and I wanted to start with them. In a campaign, I know you guys were involved in a lot of campaigns in 2024. What was the thing that, when you're making spending allocations or when you're looking at data after campaigns, have been run, what mediums are moving numbers the most?
Yep. So I would say it's less about the specific mediums because we've shown from the randomized controlled experiments we've conducted that it's very dependent on each particular race, each particular candidate, and each particular message and audience. So, it's really about finding the right messages and finding a way to deliver them that is effective and resonates. So we've done experiments in which broadcast ads work really well and others in which broadcast ads have worked very poorly. And we've seen the same with direct mail. We've seen the same with digital ads and so on. So I would say, the key is finding the messages that work, which in this election were the ones that focused on the economy, including inflation, immigration, crime, whether voters' concerns were based in data or not. The reality was that the Republicans in particular in this cycle did a good job of communicating to voters how these issues affected them and finding ways across media to deliver those messages in a way that that resonated with voters who, in many cases, and I know we're going to get to talk about targeting in a moment, in many cases were not the voters who traditionally would have been thought of as persuadable.
Echo a lot of that. Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a exactly right answer, and it's tough to add much to it. I will say from this, from the primary in the presidential campaign, we actually did a fairly expensive study. We spent about $17 million in which we built a pre and post score in the 4 early primary states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. And what we did is we went in and modeled every person with a DeSantis and Trump propensity score, and then we split it into individual media markets. And if anyone wants to read more about this, Sasha Eisenberg actually came in. We kind of let him look behind the windows, and he wrote a piece about it for Political Magazine. And if you just Google Sasha Eisenberg or Ron DeSantis, I'm sure it'll pop up. And what we found in that was really the only thing that I would add to what Andrew said was television broadcast clearly had the biggest impact. There's no question about that. Like, we didn't need to spend the money to prove that. What we did find is text messaging and the delivery of video ads by text messaging had the second greatest impact, actually greater than cable, greater than direct mail. And what was interesting, and I think Billy alluded to this, they found this at CLF, the frequency was very dependent on the movement of the voter. And in fact, what we found is the difference between, I think, 7 and 11, I believe, is where we kind of had a real big difference, that we were able to move someone much statistically significantly closer to being a DeSantis voter at that point was, again, by that, where we didn't find that as much on the broadcast side. It was not as much of a difference based on the size of the buy. Now, maybe that we didn't test enough different sizes of buys. We didn't have a completely unlimited budget, but that would be. And then from a standpoint of messaging, and I agree completely with what Andrew said, what we did, we started playing with this cycle is something called a message resonance score. And we built a artificial intelligence texting platform that would go in and text voters in early states, have conversations with them, again, just using AI, and it would disclose if someone asked if it was AI. We would say, "Hi, this is Chris DeSantis, helping elect Ron DeSantis governor," and we would go from there. It would feed in whatever the top message we had built for them was. And let's say, to take Andrew's example, it was the economy, and then have a conversation with them about economy. Then we'd feed the responses back in and try and build a message resonance score for each individual voter that would allow us to then deliver, be it direct mail, texting, or even OTT ads directly to them about those messaging. We didn't get far enough along in the process to figure out whether or not that worked, because obviously we dropped out the Saturday after Iowa. And Iowa wasn't not a good example as to whether it worked. But we played with it some more in the general election, but not as much as I would like to have. And I think that is still an ongoing testing of the utilization of this technology.
Definitely echo a lot of what's said. I'll add from the CLF perspective, obviously a lot of our targeting and voter contact is about persuading voters in the middle to support their house, to support the Republican House candidate or to not like the Democrat House candidate. And, you have to have all those things that were talked about on here. You got to have the right message. You got to have the right candidate. But most of all, I'm glad Chris brought up frequency, because at the end of the day, it's not groundbreaking, but where we saw the numbers move the most was where we were spending the most money on as many things as possible, but especially streaming and broadcast television. And it's not that exciting, but it's amazing as the world gets more diversified and people consume stuff through more different ways. It actually has added to the importance of just more and volume and weight. There's just no way to replace it. So I want to connect this to targeting now. The voter file is something that is the center of Republican data, and it's not just political data, and it's the basis of if you're running a small county commissioner race, you're still looking at who lives in your county commissioner district to mail stuff to them, or to text them, send postcards to get out to vote. Or if you're running a giant, Dave McCormick super PAC, I'm sure they looked at the Pennsylvania voter file and they knew the inside and out. And it's incredibly useful tool, obviously, for data to contact people. Obviously, to analyze the geography your race is in. But I'm not totally sure, a lot of people get excited about first party lists they can pull from voter files to target voters. I'm not totally sure that's something that is as effective or something that we do as much as we used to. Andrew, would you agree with that or disagree?
No, I think that's right. I think there is definitely tremendous value in using the voter file. There's a lot of data there, including method people use to vote, when they vote, ethnicity, all sorts of variables that are useful. But I think that there has been a shift, particularly in this cycle, because there is new awareness that some of the audiences that we had presumed were likely to vote a certain way, their behavior is more malleable than previously suspected. And so each political environment, each campaign, each message has to be considered unique. And that means that it's important to use this data for testing, not just to make assumptions about who might be persuadable, who is solidly in your camp, who is never going to be in your camp. And so for each election, I think it's important to go out with a set of testable messages that are seen as likely to be effective, and present them to a broad range of voters to analyze their effectiveness, and use that information together with the voter list for delivering ads. But given the greater cost of some of that targeting, and given the difficulty of targeting in some platforms, it often makes sense for campaigns to use a mixture of broadcast plus narrowcast.
Totally agree with a lot of what was said there. Now, Max, I think, I worked at a super PAC where we were spending a ton on broadcast and digital to persuade people in the center, which is probably why, they'll talk about we still did a lot of first party targeting. It's definitely something we lean on less. Max, I know what you did in Pennsylvania this cycle was a ton of data and first party targeting for a much different type of objective that's still very important to winning.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think, Andrew said this well, right? We saw voters were much more malleable this time. And I think a lot of people like to refer to the 24 election as the podcast election. I really look at it as the informed electorate election. So, now we know that our voters have a lot of different ways of consuming information, a lot of different ways of getting to the opinion that they're eventually going to have, different ways of deciding how they're going to vote, when they're going to vote, who they're going to vote for. And we have a lot more avenues to put that information in front of them. We knew at the RSLC this last cycle, something that we wanted to tackle was the absentee early vote by mail issue that Republicans, I think we can all just be super honest, had found ourselves in a massive hole when it came to vote by mail across the country. Pennsylvania was a really good opportunity to right that ship. We lost the state house in Pennsylvania by 63 votes in the 22 cycle. There were a lot of low propensity voters who stayed home. We utilized this cycle as our opportunity to right that ship. And what we did, you look at modeling and how it's typically applied to Republican versus Democrat, persuadable, non-persuadable, GOTV versus swing voter, or GOTV versus low prop voter. We utilized modeling this cycle to find voters whose opinion we could change about vote by mail. So we only modeled Republicans, and we looked at 3.2 million Republicans. Day one, we got our model back, and we threw 2.2 million of those Republicans in the garbage. We narrowed our list down to about 1 million folks. And then we took that model, we took those 1 million voters, and we thought, okay, given the avenues we have to put messaging in front of them, how do we see what message is not only going to make them vote Republican, but make them vote by mail, make them cast an absentee ballot? We broke those 1 million voters into something north of 20 different sub-universes, essentially, of anything from no trust in the vote by mail process. How do we rebuild their trust? Do we utilize Donald Trump messaging saying it's okay to bring them back to the table when it comes to vote by mail? One of the more interesting universes we found was this military message that we utilized, and something I had been super interested in for years and years. And it wasn't, targeting military voters. It was the military votes by mail when they are overseas. They trust the system. We trust them. Vote like they do. That's a slogan that we ended up utilizing a lot. And we saw, through the application of this program and through the application of layering data on data, that it wasn't young men who responded to that message. It was a lot of moms. It was 45 to 65-year-old women who all of a sudden were looking at this. Oh my gosh, you have this military message. Well, once we narrowed that group down and we saw that we have this 20-year age range of female voters, well, now we know exactly how to put this message in front of them, right? And these are people who are actually checking their mailboxes. These are people who spend a lot of time on Facebook. And from there, we were able to target them in a really cost-effective way, and we were able to avoid the broadcast messaging and go straight to these small targets of voters, and ultimately move huge groups of voters into the vote by mail universe. Democrats saw their vote by mail participation shrink by about 500,000 voters in the 24 cycle. Republicans actually surpassed where we were in the 2020 COVID election. We brought more vote by mail voters to the table in Pennsylvania than we did in 2020, and we did that very cost effectively, and it was by utilizing, I would call it beyond micro targeting pockets of 20,000 voters at a time, and bringing them to the table through a variety of mediums.
Yeah, no, and it was evident in the absentee data in Pennsylvania. We had two huge flips in PA7 and PA8 this cycle. One in the Philadelphia market, one in the Scranton market, which were extremely cluttered media markets. But there were two huge flips for us this cycle, and it was evident at first that the Republicans were not doing what they needed to in absentee data in Pennsylvania this cycle from the outset. But in places like Nevada, people were just naturally popping up. But the way that every day we close the gap in Pennsylvania, which I think is a real credit to the RSLC's effort, them working with the Keystone PAC that Brendan ran for McCormick. I know it was super, super important. But to me, it's very interesting because there are endless applications of micro-targeting and first-party targeting when you're doing something on a scale and trying to turn out voters, through things like digital mail, text, like Max was doing. But I'm personally seeing on the persuasion side way less opportunities to target. Digital is looking more and more every day like a TV buy. We're kind of strategizing in a lot of the same ways as far as live sports and targeting broader demos, as opposed to a lot of the first party lists in the early days of digital that we used a lot. That all being said, we still invested a ton in modeling at CLF and voter modeling for targeting, which it was incredibly useful still because we still had opportunities to use it in digital. We still did a giant absentee program, and it was an incredibly important way to understand these districts, target in these districts, and work with polling to better understand what was going on and what was going to happen and what our path forward was. Chris's old company was one of our main modeling vendors at CLF. And, so I've known him and his people and talked about this a lot over the years on how we use modeling and stuff like that. Chris, I would just be curious your perspective on, how is the usefulness of micro-targeting and modeling, changing over recent years? How are you seeing it changing? And are you similarly, finding some areas of voter contact where it's becoming way more important versus way less important?
Yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in that. I think first I would echo everything that Andrew and Max that RSLC had in terms of getting out the absentee ballot cannot be understated. Increasing absentee voters, and not just in Pennsylvania, but really in every state where we had increases. And to tie that into Dominic's question, I think one of the things that we saw, and I think specifically in Texas, where I did Senator Cruz's reelect, and it was, for a while, that was a pretty tight race. He ended up winning fairly comfortably, but it was tight for a while. And so where our direct targeting worked and where we saw an individual measurement really being applicable and important was in areas that just 6 years ago, we did not really have strong efforts. And that was down in the Valley, heavily Hispanic areas where both Donald Trump and Ted Cruz were able to flip those voters pretty dramatically. And in fact, if you look at it, where we picked up Congressional, we're really more at the state House, state Senate level, where we picked up seats, and again, credit to the RSLC on that, we were able to really dominate in a lot of the Valley regions where even just 8 years ago, Trump was not competitive. He was in single digits, and then he's winning those areas. And it's remarkable in terms of the overall cultural shift that took place there. And I think it is a testament to groups like CLF, RSLC that didn't give up on those, targeted them, got involved in Congressional and state House, state Senate races that were not necessarily seen as competitive even just a few short cycles ago. But the other thing that I saw, the Trump campaign, just to give them complete credit, utilized data for on a targeting perspective that I think had a big impact for both CLF, the races y'all targeted, and I would assume the RSLC too, is the low propensity voters. Those that we would have just left out of all of our files, again, for certainly 8 years ago. And I saw that, and Domenic, we were talking earlier about some races I was involved in out in California where we didn't win, but we got a lot closer. Close doesn't really matter, but you saw these low propensity voters that were just starting to turn out that I think I don't think it was a worthless investment, because I think based on what's going on in California now, you're going to see those seats start to slip and more of those voters move back to us. And it's really good that they did not give up on those and continue the targeting. One other thing I'll mention, coming back to the last panel that I thought was really interesting, particularly we found to be the case in Texas, and I would imagine was probably the case in Pennsylvania, but I'd be appreciative of your perspective on this, Max, is when we bought sports for Ted Cruz in Texas, it was less expensive, dramatically less expensive to do a national buy than it was to do a statewide buy in Texas. There's 18 media markets contained in Texas, 28 markets that bleed into Texas. And from that, so it's funny, every time we'd go up on TV and we'd buy, the Texans or something like that, I could count on it. I'd get multiple texts or emails, phone calls from friends of mine. Hey, you guys are screwing up your buy. I just saw it up in Nebraska, or I saw it out in California. Like, no, it's like half the price to do a national buy than it is to just do in Texas. And to your point about the way targeting has evolved, I mean, that had to be really good for some TV stations around the country to be able to receive those buys come in.
We ran into the complete same thing with national sports, and we're huge believers in sports because it is, active live eyeballs on the commercials. Right. People are not fast forwarding. They're watching it live. I will say it does, but to Chris's point, we started buying national sports all the time because it wasn't just cheaper, but a lot of times it actually was a better spot. And it was a better spot both in the placement, because if you watch your local news, you can see which window is all the, DMA specific ads. So you just watch 15 political ads in a row and you're like, no one saw that. You can get your ads sitting between, two insurance commercials. I think it's a lot more effective. A hunch. It might not be true, but I think it is. And then additionally, a lot of times when these games are on cable stations, even if they're a pretty widely viewed cable station, if you're buying, those cable zones specific to our congressional district, we're often missing out on a lot of important platforms. I remember one time the buyer came to me and he was like, "Oh yeah, we can buy that game on this," and it gets like most of the district, but like it's not people on YouTube TV, and he listed like 5 other major platforms that people all watch TV on. I'm like, oh, well, we have to do the national because I know there's a lot of important voters on those platforms. So we also did national sports buying all the time. It's especially fun in congressional races because, if you really think about it, how many people are we really trying to target in that ad? And we're buying throughout the country, and it was a ton of fun to get texts from friends or try to watch it myself. I had a special budget this cycle to add national sports inventory, and it was probably the highlight of my cycle because it's probably a job I've been training for my entire life. But no, totally agree. It's like that's when we saw numbers moving, and we always knew it was the best money we had spent. Thinking about targeting voters, I've heard a lot both in this panel and the panel before about how much winning elections is now about turnout and turnout dynamics changing, and that's especially how we see these huge realignments that we're seeing across the Trump era, whether it's in suburbs, kind of moving the wrong way, or maybe in, for us, I should say, or in a blue collar area like the Rio Grande in Texas, where it's really moving the right way. It's totally about turnout shifting dynamics. That being said, and I'd be interested in all three of your opinions on this, is the swing or persuadable voter dying, like as someone we're targeting?
I don't think so. I think that there are more swing and persuadable voters than we had thought of, than we had thought there were. I think that, after the 2012 election, there was this belief, which was not one I subscribed to, but which many people subscribed to, and not just among Obama supporters, that the electorate had permanently changed, and that Republicans were never going to win another election unless they moderated their views, because they could not survive with such low levels of support among non-white voters in particular, as we saw in 2008 and 2012. And what we've seen is that was something that was more changeable than had previously been thought. Trump, that there was a return to previous elections. If you look at, George Bush's support among Hispanic voters in 2004, for example, or if you look at John Kerry's lower levels of support among Black voters in then you can see that Obama was unique in a lot of ways, and it's very candidate specific. And I think Trump is unique in a lot of ways. And what we've seen in the past 3 cycles with Trump at the top of the ticket for Republicans will not necessarily hold true for the next Republican in 4 years' time. So I think we have to get away from the idea that because something was true in 1 election or 2 elections or 3 elections, that necessarily means it's going to be true in the next election or the election after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we looked at the swing voter this cycle is really the difference between a swing voter and a low propensity voter is becoming increasingly, so it's shrinking. A low propensity voter is by and large a swing voter. You look at a lot of the work we did at the RSLC, a lot of the work we did in conjunction with our partners in Pennsylvania. We became obsessed with low propensity voters, and in turn, we became obsessed with swing voters. And we tell this story often. And Andrew, I'm sorry, but we essentially, we've gotten a lot of credit for the work we've done in Pennsylvania. We stole the Democrat playbook, like verbatim. The Pennsylvania Dems put out a memo following the 2018 election talking about how they targeted low prop voters aggressively with a ton of money. And their goal was to turn a low prop voter into a vote by mail voter. And in turn, they were messaging them with Democrat talking points, Democrat messaging. So when that low prop voter became a vote by mail voter, they now became a Democrat voter, and they became a Democrat vote by mail voter. And over the course of the next 3 years, they became a high prop voter. So Democrats effectively expanded their base of voters. We needed to go and reverse engineer that. So we started targeting low prop voters 40, 50 times way ahead of the primary, with a goal of turning a low prop voter, i.e. a swing voter, into a higher propensity Republican voter. And that's how we spent our cycle. We started talking to, most of our budget was focused on 1 out of 4 election voters, and just hammering them over and over and over again about the message that the data said was most likely to move them to our side. But beyond that, most likely to turn them into a high prop voter, or in our case, a male voter. We brought them to the table earlier than we ever had before. And everybody says it's to free up resources for your GOTV efforts. That's genuinely not the case. When people tell you that the point of vote by mail is to free up resources for your final 72-hour GOTV push, it's not. It's to expand your base of voters. It's to create more Republicans. And we got a really big jump start. And again, no offense, I think Democrats strayed from that model this last cycle. And we were able to fill that gap. And we did it utilizing YouTube. We did it utilizing mail. We did it utilizing peer-to-peer text messaging. And therefore, we were able to fly under the radar of all of the broadcasts that was happening over our heads. And we were able to specifically target these people who otherwise we'd always said, it's way too expensive. And we were like, well, yeah, we know that. It is way too expensive. But if we bring them out, they're going to vote for us. And now, what are you willing to spend on Dave McCormick's win, right? Is it an extra $10 million, an extra $16 million in our case? The answer was yes, and it worked.
Yeah, I don't know that the variability, and I probably would have answered this question 4 years ago, the variability maybe of an individual voter doesn't change. The variability of the concern on an issue is what changes. And so the key is understanding the evolution of the issues. And I'll go back to the Rio Grande Valley with Hispanic voters, African-American voters in a lot of urban areas where it may not have had an impact at the congressional level. Sorry, Domenic, but who knows, it may ultimately, and it certainly did at the state level. And I think if you look at Trump's win and the kind of running the table on swing states, that is directly attributable to that. So where did that come from? It came from economic issues. It came from immigration issues, which Andrew mentioned earlier. And so maybe what we need to do is stop looking at elections in terms of the variability of the individual voter and maybe the variability of the issue set. And I think, again, that's kind of the excitement about what I'm doing and the understanding of that, because the technology that exists to understand those issue concerns and then being able to message on those individual concerns and deliver that messaging directly to voters is only going to increase over time. And that, to me, is what's exciting about what we do for a living.
All right. Do we want to do one more or go to Q&A?
Let's see if we have time for a quick question, because I got to let these guys eat. Go ahead. Give us a wrap question, though.
Okay. I think the one thing I wanted to touch on is, everyone here has varying backgrounds in polling. Polling's still my favorite thing because it's for the same reason everyone likes to click on public polls here, right? Like it's exciting, it's fun, it's like the live scoreboard of the election, even if it's wrong. I always think polling has been getting a bad rap. There's definitely stuff they have to improve. There's definitely stuff that have to change. But I mean, Andrew and Chris, I especially want to hear from you guys, but Max, if you want to chime in as well, I would just be curious your guys' opinion on why we still like polling, why it's still important, even if it's not the most perfectly accurate thing in the world, but also how it's changing. Because what I feel like what's going on with polling and just, the prescriptive value and strategic value of polling is still so important to what I do. And it is because it shows us the path to win or no. And our polling and also the messaging and how and who to target, it all starts with polling. And it's the basis of what we do. And it doesn't have to perfectly predict a margin by 1 point or 2 points. for it to do that. And that's why, people will continue to invest a ton in polling, as we have at CLF, and I'm sure CLF will in the future. But it's changing a lot. How we collect changes it, what we have to expect, the cost. I mean, Andrew, can you speak to that a little?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, polling is important because we need data. Campaigns need to make decisions every day. Which message, which issues, which voters should we be targeting? How should we be delivering this? And so even with all its imperfections, we need to have some data. I think polling has gone omni-channel across platforms. And, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago, for the past 2 decades, a lot of the debate has been about online versus telephone. And now people are thinking about bringing and are actually conducting experiments in which they're bringing back mail. And obviously people are using SMS. And in the last 2 years, there's been an explosion, which I know Chris is going to talk about, in the use of AI. And 2 years ago, it wasn't there. And I've worked with many folks who I trust, who I've worked with for years and years, who are now using AI, synthetic data, synthesized panels, and collecting results. And we've been comparing those results to results collected in the other very flawed ways of collecting data, including online survey panels and SMS and as well as telephone polls and other modes. And there are certain advantages that the AI data has. And I think that's going to be a big part of what happens in polling over the next couple of years.
So yeah, I just made a move from what was is the largest Republican polling and data firm to a company called EyesOver that is solely artificial intelligence driven. And I did that because I had the opportunity to serve as an informal advisor to them and saw the accuracy of what they were doing in the last cycle. And I thought I had 3 options. One is to try and begin to do that with my own firm. The second would have been to start a new one, or the third is to join this one. And they offered me to come over. So it was a great opportunity. Polling has had an evolution over time. It started door to door, and then mail, and then it went to phones, and they did it from lists. Remember the Reader's Digest, Dewey beats Truman, and then it went to random digit dialing, then registration-based sampling, then proportional probability selection, as Andrew mentioned, and lots of different mode collection. And so when I began polling, and which has been, God, it's hard to believe, 30 years ago, to do a 300 sample, we could pull 3,000 names to get that sample. Today, to get 300 interviews, we have to pull a sample of 100,000 names. That is not statistically sampling. It is a blunt force instrument in which the pollster is really is weighting it to what they believe is the case. And that's kind of what goes on behind it. And if you ever want to see it, ask to see the raw data, and you'll be a little bit disturbed by what you see. So what I got to participate in and watch was the evolution of the utilization of this artificial intelligence. And I'll tell you, there's a great the Harvard data scientist review by Argyle and others about the utilization of AI, of original data, for the purposes of predicting what polling would predict, would find. And it was actually incredibly accurate. It's a 2023 sample, so it's a study, so it's a year behind where we currently are in that. And in what EyesOver did for the Trump campaign was predict 49 out of 50 states exactly right. And that was something that I couldn't even get close to in what we were doing. So I do believe it's the future. Does polling go away? No, it doesn't. There is still, to what Domenic said, the utilization of it for collecting messaging is still important. But traditional polling cannot get as close to predicting the outcome of a race as AI is already doing. And that to me is what's exciting, because I do think it's just going to get more and more. And I'm actually experimenting right now. Last week, if you paid attention in Texas to the speaker's election, this was this week, but I was doing the work last week, where we're using AI for data collection to predict what the outcome was going to be in individual districts. I'm using it right now for building analytics across the country in different upcoming 26 gubernatorial races I'm involved in. So I'm going to keep experimenting with it. I think it's exciting. There's a lot of academic research being done in it. It could not be a tool yet for the RSLC because you can't get it down to the state assembly, state rep level. But that's today. I think ultimately it will grow into that, and I think it will ultimately end up replacing traditional polling.
Guys, thank you so much. You get a chance to talk to these guys over lunch. That was fantastic. Very packed panel. Thanks, guys.